Hello, I'm Miranda, and my group chose to research the Rorschach ink blot test. The Rorschach test was named after Hermann Rorschach, the creator of the test, who was a Swiss psychiatrist that studied intelligence and mental disorders. He played a game called Klexography in his free time, which is a game in which individuals create a story behind ambiguous stimuli. When playing the game with individuals who had schizophrenia, he noticed that they made associations that were way different from the norm of people without the disorder. He began research, developing a version of the inkblot test and conducting experiments with adolescent participants, ages 12 to 16. He asked the participants what image they saw in an ambiguous ink blot and where they saw it in the ink blot, and he began interpreting their answers. He found that the ink blot test was a beneficial way to learn about individuals and their perception and apperception, or how their experiences, ideas, and knowledge affect their perceptions and ideas. So he continued researching it in that context. He determined that their responses were very informative, including information about their cognition, memory, behaviors, and relationship with the environment and people around them. Rorschach officially developed the test in 1921, and he used it to identify disordered thinking, including disorganized thought processes and reasoning. He used it to characterize different types of pathology, especially in adolescents and adults with schizophrenia. However, in 1939, psychologists began using the test as a measure of personality. The test is multidimensional, as it measures coping style, affect regulation, information processing, and self perception. The format of the test takes into account the location in which an individual sees an idea, its determinants, content, and the popularity of the answer compared to norms. And this all factors into scoring processes and affects its multidimensionality. In the current day, the Rorschach test is used in clinical settings to measure personality structure, emotional functioning, thought processes, and as a supplementary tool in evaluations, often used in a broad battery of tests. However, the test is also used in forensic settings, as it may be more informative than a self-report because individuals going through legal battles may not be completely honest about their characteristics. So, for example, it has been used in child custody evaluations and in criminal proceedings. There is a range of uses for this test, so it may not be used just for one demographic, but historically it has been used for individuals with schizophrenia to identify different thought patterns that may deviate from the norm. And it may be administered to children, adolescents, and adults, but typically it is administered to adults or people older than the age of 14. The test itself has not changed over time. They still use the same categorization of ink blots because some ink blots have to be monochromatic without any color besides black. Some have to be colored, and then some are a mixture of both. Likewise, it has also been administered the same throughout time. We'll learn more about that later, but essentially, in the administration process, the test administrator will ask the individual what they see in the image and then later ask them to elaborate on this. However, one thing that has changed over time is that the test did not have a standardized scoring system. But now someone developed the RPAS, which is a standardized method that helps the scoring process, which can be very complicated for projective tests such as the Rorschach test. And these are my references. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Ashley, and I'm going to be doing the next part of our presentation on the Rorschach inkblot test. So what exactly is the Rorschach inkblot test? So the Rorschach inkblot test is a projective test used specifically to measure personality. A projective test is going to be looking at a person's unconscious emotions, personality, or even internal hidden conflicts. This is also a subjective test that is scored by a scorer. So there's no right or wrong answers. There's not like a yes, no. It's whatever the person would like to say. And then who would use this test? A licensed psychologist or psychiatrist would be the one using this test. And specifically, who are the test takers? That would be clients or, in some cases, inmates. Since this test can be used in multiple settings, you have the clinical setting, which it's used for diagnosing, specifically like schizophrenia, and understanding like a client's personality. Then you have the forensic psychology route, which they use this test in legal cases for personality assessment, and then also in correctional facilities for evaluation of their inmates. The cost of this test kind of depends. So there are free versions that are offered online. They are not always the best options to be using since it's not coming from somebody who has been taught how to use the test. In order for somebody to give this test, they need to get a certificate. To get the certificate, it kind of depends. Some places, when a therapist is getting their training, offer to give them the training for free. Outside of that, doing it on your own, it can get upwards to about $350 to do the training for the test, and then it's about another about 122 for the set of the little 10 test plates, so the pictures that are used. So overall, it can get very costly very quickly, but after the therapist has their certificate, it doesn't cost them to give out the test. And so then what does the test look like? So the test consists of 10 ink blots. There are 5 black and gray ink blots, 2 that are black, gray, and red, and then 3 that are multicolored. So the examiner records all of the responses, behaviors, emotions, or even the orientation that the person looks at the test, like at the ink blots at, and they write that all down, and they also take down the time it takes for a person to respond. For those, there's no time limit that's given to the subjects, however, the time that it takes them is written down. Subjects are then also asked to describe like the photo they're presented with, to describe like what they're seeing. This can be like if they're seeing like one side's reflecting the other side, do they see a person, do they see an animal? And then the examiner does go through the cards a second time, just to make sure that they are seeing the exact same thing. It's not necessarily to get new information, but more just to confirm the information they already obtained. The scoring is broken into multiple sections. There is an image here on like what some of the scoring would look like. So the sections are broken down into content, location, and determinants. So your content is going to be if they saw a human, what the human detail is, if they see an animal, what the animal detail is, if they saw like a plant or a tree, that nature, and there's a couple of others. Then when they're scoring it, they write down like a W or an F or an FC. They're simpler ways to write down exactly what the person saw, saying like this was a human detail, which would be HD. Then you also have location, so did what they were seeing, is it part of the white space? Is it the whole ink blot? Or is it just the most commonly described place of the ink blot? And then your determinants are going to be what colors they were noticing. So if they saw a flower on one of the pictures because of the red outlining, that would be one of the determinants. It can also be form if they're seeing like reflections. And so then that's how the scoring is broken down, as they figure out what each person is seeing. And then from that is compared against norms. There are two tests that these norms are pulled from typically. Then there's the RPAS, which is our current standard. These norms are compiled from global samples, and it's the most commonly used one now. The second one is the Exner Comprehensive System. That one is the original standard from John Exner, and that one's going to be based specifically from American samples. So it's not as common anymore since there were a bunch of errors that came out of it, since it was just focused on Americans versus a global standpoint. For validity and reliability, the reliability wise, there's a low retest reliability rate. So oftentimes when they retested people, they came out back with different answers than the first time around. So they were getting different scores and changing what the answers were and what the results were. And then it also had low inter-rater agreement. So one rater would be very different than somebody else rating a test. This could also just be because of the details that that person noticed. And then for validity, the face validity is low. So most of the time when people are told, hey, we have some pictures for you to look at, and they're basically told this is going to help you determine your personality, it doesn't have a strong face validity to begin with. And then Exner, who I did mention before, he came up with more rigorous scoring systems to try and help improve validity. It didn't do a lot to help with the validity, but he was definitely trying to make it better since it was such low validity to begin with. With that being said, there are correlations with general intelligence and the results of the Rorschach-Inkblot test. There's also a strong correlation with the diagnosis of schizophrenia and sometimes borderline personality disorders. Outside of those two, there's no consistent correlations or relationships with any other factors. So overall, the validity is also very low unless you're using it specifically to like diagnose schizophrenia.
These were the first two responses I got when I tried to conduct test user interviews. The first was from a clinical psychologist, and the second was from a personality psychologist. They both seem pretty not in favor of using the test. I decided to look a little more into the weak validity and reliability. I found an article that talked about personality psychologist Bruno Klopfer, who at one time was considered the #1 proponent of the test. And he had a couple controversial views. He pretty much said to forget norms and traditional validity, and that informal observation and intuition are enough. He acknowledged that individual test results do not have a straightforward relationship with personality characteristics, but that doesn't really matter, because if you're an expert interpreter, you can extract everything you need from the test alone without having to integrate information from other sources. He kind of thought that traditional validity tests were a waste of time. That ultimately, all they would do would show that these expert interpreters were right all along. That all they would do would show what these expert interpreters already knew. Kind of an assumption. Then I found an article that looked into an application of the test for discriminating between psychopaths and non-psychopaths. and it found that only 5 of the 37 variables they tested showed what was described as a moderate relationship. The strongest validity coefficient was with aggression potential, which was in favor of a hypothesis that stated the content validity of the test is stronger than the structural validity of the test. I was able to conduct an interview with the user of the test. They said its use is rare, but that it is used in specific contexts. Specifically, it's good at predicting psychosis or schizophrenia later in life. It has sort of a unique ability to catch it before it happens. They said that responses can also highlight things that are difficult to verbalize. Something that a client may have difficulty talking about, or they may not know how to open up about it to their therapist. Their responses to the test can highlight potential areas of concern. And the test is not as universally applicable as initially thought. It's like that one study that I talked about earlier that attempted to use it to discriminate between psychopaths and non-psychopaths, and found that only 5 of the 37 variables had a moderate relationship with the test results. They said the administration and scoring of the test is very time intensive, and that administration should be standardized. And unfortunately, this creates a situation where the therapist cannot communicate the results with the client right away. And they can't really communicate with the client during the administration either. So this requires good client rapport and trust. They said the projective nature of the test allows for unique contextualization that objective measures cannot provide. For the test taker interview, I interviewed someone that took an online version of the test. On the Rorschach website, they scrolled through the series of slides of the ink blots. And they said that they were definitely familiar with the test, as far as they had seen it depicted in TV or movies before, with a therapist showing a client the series of ink blots and asking them to describe what they see. They were kind of unsure about its use, but thought that possibly it could measure a mood or anxiety level. They didn't think that the test results are conclusive by themselves, and because of this, they didn't think there was much risk for stigma associated with the results. And they didn't really think there was much of a risk for something like social desirability bias when responding. They did say, though, that on the website underneath the slides, they listed common responses to the shapes, and that after reading them, they went back and scrolled through the slides again, and they found it difficult to see the shape as something other than one of the common responses. And they said that they would be willing to take the test in a professional clinical setting if it were along with other tests. They didn't seem to think the test by itself held much weight, that the test by itself and its results on their own couldn't really tell you much. I think the test became popular because, similar to Freud's psychoanalysis, people thought it was going to be a way to expose the subconscious, that the responses to the ink blot shapes could reveal something about an individual that otherwise would have remained hidden. I agree with most of the views that I learned about when learning about the test. The one that I do not agree with are the views of personality psychologist Bruno Klopfer, who said, forget traditional validity testing, forget norms. All we need is the intuition from expert interpreters. And I don't agree with that because I think validity, reliability, those scientific rigors are necessary. That's part of the reason why I agree with the other views that are both in support of and not in support of using the test. It's because they take into account the validity and reliability in different contexts and settings. One of the criticisms of the test is that it produces a high false positive rate for distorted thinking, close to 50%. So if you think about that in a large scale research setting, a close to 50% false positive rate is definitely not acceptable. That cannot be happening. But if you look at investigating disorganized thinking of an individual, like in a therapist client relationship, maybe the therapist has conducted interviews with a group of friends the client had in college, and some of the information they get from the interviews indicates that distorted thinking could be a concern. And then the client maybe scores high for distorted thinking in an objective measure. And then their Rorschach responses also indicate um, that distorted thinking could be a concern. I think in that context, it's probably not a false positive, that there is reliability and validity there. But that's because the test is being used with other measures. It's part of an assessment. It's providing one piece of the puzzle. It's one of many tools. And that was the main thing that kept popping into my head from class 2 when I was learning and thinking about the test was assessment. Um, Even the test taker interview that I conducted, they just did a quick scroll through of the slides online. And when I asked them if they'd be willing to take the test in a professional clinical setting, they said yes, but that if it was part of other testing. So, in other words, they didn't think that by itself the test held much weight, but that as part of an assessment, that it could be useful. Um, an example of another inappropriate setting for the test um, has received criticism and is controversial is the use of the test for high stakes decision making, such as in court or with forensic psychology. And I agree that in a setting like that, the test is not appropriate to use because there needs to be the most validity and reliability possible. And then in a larger research setting as well, where they want as most validity and reliability as possible because they want to replicate the results on increasingly large populations for external validity, the test is not appropriate in those contexts and settings. But then there are other contexts and settings in which the test is very useful and actually has some really unique utility, such as being able to predict a psychotic episode or schizophrenia later on in life, able to detect it before it happens. And in the context of a therapist and client relationship, that's extremely useful. That is a very high utility. And I think the reason we've been able to critique and learn all of this about the Rorschach is because of the scientific rigors that the test has been put through. It's because the validity and reliability has been tested and found to be insufficient in some settings, and then in other settings, um, there was a really unique utility discovered.